In the autumn of 1962, the American sky tasted like copper and paranoia. The Cuban Missile Crisis had gripped the nation by the throat, transforming the nightly television broadcast into a terrifying, agonizing countdown to Armageddon. In the remote, sun-baked town of San Miguel, Nevada, the fear was not an abstract political concept broadcasted from Washington. It was a physical tremor felt deep in the floorboards. Situated less than 100 miles from the Nevada test site, the residents of San Miguel had spent the last decade watching the horizon bloom with artificial, blinding suns. They knew exactly what the end of the world looked like. They had seen its mushroom-shaped silhouette painted against the dawn, and they had swept its radioactive dust from their porches. While the looming threat of nuclear annihilation drove most Americans to frantic prayers, duck and covered drills, and the panic hoarding of canned goods, Aldos and Carmela Sterling saw something entirely different. They looked at the terrified, wealthy elite of the Nevada desert and saw the ultimate, unexploited gold mine. Fear, as Carmela frequently whispered to her husband over their evening martinis, was the most expensive commodity on earth, and the Sterlings were about to corner the market. Aldos Sterling was a man constructed of cold logic and rigid angles. A brilliant structural engineer originally from Chicago, he possessed a mind that operated strictly in load-bearing calculations, tensile strengths, and poured concrete. Following a lucrative but unremarkable career as a military contractor building subterranean storage facilities, he had realized how easily the earth could swallow a secret. He was a quiet, imposing figure with pale, unblinking eyes that evaluated human beings as if they were unstable architecture. He lacked empathy entirely, viewing morality as nothing more than a structural flaw that weakened the overall design of a man. His wife, Carmela, was a dazzling facade that hid his brutal foundation. Born in Buenos Aires and having immigrated to the United States a decade prior, she was a woman of devastating, predatory charm. Where Aldos was stone, Carmela was water, fluid, adaptive, and capable of slipping past any defense. She wore impeccably tailored Dior suits, her dark hair perfectly coiffed, and possessed a voice that dripped with expensive, hypnotic sympathy. She was a master of psychological manipulation, possessing an uncanny ability to read a person's deepest anxieties and mirror them back as salvation. Together, they were the perfect apex predators of the atomic age. In the spring of 1962, anticipating the escalating geopolitical tensions, the couple founded Sterling Survival Solutions. Their target demographic was highly specific: the paranoid, the isolated, and the exceptionally wealthy. Men who owned lucrative silver mines, retired Hollywood producers seeking desert isolation, and oil barons who trusted no one but their checkbooks. Carmela was the face of the operation. She would visit these affluent, terrified individuals in their sprawling ranch homes, pouring them imported scotch and speaking in hushed, sorrowful tones about the inevitability of Soviet aggression. She sold them not just survival, but luxury survival. She presented them with the promise of absolute safety, wrapped in velvet and lead. When the sirens sound, Mr. Davis, Carmela would purr, resting a manicured hand on a client's trembling arm, her dark eyes brimming with manufactured concern. You shouldn't have to suffer in a damp, municipal shelter with the panicked masses. Your wealth has insulated you from the ugliness of the world above. It should do the same below. You deserve dignity. You deserve an absolute fortress. Once the psychological hook was set, and the exorbitant down payment was transferred into Carmela's meticulously managed accounts, Aldos would step in and unroll the blueprints. The designs Aldos presented were marvels of subterranean engineering. The proposed bunkers were deep, sprawling capsules buried 30 feet beneath the hard Nevada bedrock. They boasted 3-foot-thick walls of reinforced, high-density concrete, independent diesel generators, state-of-the-art carbon air scrubbers, deep water wells, and luxurious living quarters stocked with enough freeze-dried gourmet food, vintage wine, and medical supplies to last a decade. To the clients, these blueprints represented salvation. But there was a second set of blueprints, the ones Aldos kept locked in a fireproof safe in their home office. These designs contained a brilliant, fatal modification. The main entrance to a Sterling bunker was a massive 6-ton vault door made of solid, blast-resistant steel, operating on heavy hydraulic hinges. According to clients' blueprints, the door was controlled from the inside via a heavy mechanical wheel, allowing the occupants to seal themselves away safely from fallout. However, Aldos had secretly designed a secondary, external mechanism, deep within the hydraulic housing, accessible only from the surface through a disguised, narrow utility pipe hidden in the landscaping, was a locking manifold. With a single turn of a specialized wrench dropped down that pipe, Aldos could permanently disable the internal wheel, completely severing the hydraulic pressure and deadlocking the steel tumblers. Once that external lock was engaged, the 6-ton steel door could never be opened from the inside again. It would become an immovable wall of iron. Aldos and Carmela had no intention of riding out the nuclear apocalypse. They didn't believe the bombs were actually going to fall. They believed in the power of the American dollar, the anonymity of the vast desert, and the beautiful, absolute silence of the grave. They were not building shelters. They were constructing the most expensive, impenetrable, and perfectly engineered coffins in human history. And their first client was practically begging to climb inside. Wallace Abernathy was a man who believed in only two things: the enduring value of Nevada silver and the inevitable treachery of human beings. As the sole owner of the sprawling Silver Queen mining operation, Abernathy had spent his 68 years accumulating vast wealth and alienating everyone around him. He was a bitter, isolated widower who lived alone on a heavily fenced, 400-acre ranch at the edge of a desolate salt flat, 30 miles outside of San Miguel. His only regular companions were the coyotes and the terrifying, static-laced television broadcasts of Nikita Khrushchev banging his shoe on a podium. Abernathy was utterly convinced that the Soviet Union had targeted his mind specifically, viewing his silver as a strategic asset. His paranoia was a raw, exposed nerve, and Carmela Sterling played it like a Stradivarius. When Carmela first arrived at the ranch in her immaculate pearl-white Cadillac, she didn't pitch a concrete box. She pitched an underground kingdom. She walked with Abernathy across his barren, sun-scorched property, listening to his frantic rants about communist infiltrators and nuclear fallout with an expression profound, validating sympathy. "A man of your stature, Mr. Abernathy, is the backbone of the American economy," Carmela whispered, sipping a glass of iced tea on his porch, her dark eyes reflecting the vast, empty desert. "If the worst happens, the government will protect its politicians, but who protects the visionaries? You have built an empire. You must preserve your legacy so that when the dust settles, you are the one who steps out to rebuild. Your survival isn't just a luxury, Wallace. It is a patriotic duty." Abernathy wrote a check for $80,000, an astronomical sum in 1962, before her iced tea was even empty. He didn't just want a bunker. He wanted a subterranean fortress that could withstand a direct hit. 2 weeks later, Aldos Sterling arrived with a convoy of heavy earth-moving equipment. To ensure absolute secrecy and avoid the prying eyes of local San Miguel gossips, Aldos employed transient laborers from 2 states over, paying them in cash and housing them on the remote property. They excavated a massive crater deep into Nevada bedrock, pouring thousands of tons of high-density, steel-reinforced concrete. They installed state-of-the-art air scrubbers, a deep-water artesian well, and a diesel generator capable of running for 5 years. The interior was appointed with the luxurious touches Carmela had promised: rich mahogany wall paneling, deep leather armchairs, a fully stocked library, a premium ham radio set, and a pantry overflowing with gourmet freeze-dried rations, vintage Bordeaux, and pure medical-grade morphine. It was a masterpiece of survivalist architecture. However, the critical phase of the construction occurred in absolute isolation. Once the heavy lifting was done, Aldos abruptly fired the out-of-state crew, citing a sudden change in project scope, and sent them back to Utah. For the final 3 days, Aldos worked entirely alone. He orchestrated the delivery and installation of the 6-ton, blast-resistant vault door using a specialized hydraulic winch. While Abernathy watched from the porch, marveling at the sheer thickness of the steel, Aldos meticulously wired the secret secondary lock. He routed the access pipe up through the soil, expertly disguising the opening within the hollow base of a heavy, decorative concrete birdbath positioned near the concealed surface entrance. On the morning of October 24th, 1962, the world held its breath. The Cuban Missile Crisis had reached a fever pitch. American naval blockades were in place, and the radio broadcasters spoke in grim, trembling voices. Abernathy was in a state of absolute, frantic terror when Aldos and Carmela arrived for the final walkthrough. He had already packed his briefcases full of silver certificates, bearer bonds, and the master deeds to his mining empire. "It is finished, Wallace," Carmela said soothingly, placing a comforting hand on his trembling shoulder. "You are safe now. Come, let us show you your new world." The three of them descended the spiraling concrete stairwell, the air growing instantly cooler and heavier. At the bottom of the stairs stood the massive steel vault door, swung wide open to reveal the warm, golden light of a fully powered bunker. Abernathy stepped through the threshold, his eyes wide with awe. He ran his callous hands over mahogany bookshelves and the pristine leather furniture. The low, reassuring hum of the diesel generator was a mechanical heartbeat, promising endless life. "It's perfect," Abernathy breathed, clutching his leather briefcases tightly to his chest. "It's absolutely perfect. I can't hear the wind. I can't hear anything from the surface. That is the beauty of the design," Aldo said, standing in the cold concrete antechamber just outside the threshold of the steel door. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. "The acoustic isolation is absolute. In fact, Wallace, we should run a final diagnostic on the primary seals, a soundproofing test. Stay right there in the center of the room. I'm going to swing the door shut and engage the outer pressure valve. You'll hear a loud click and then absolute silence." "Yes, yes, of course." Abernathy nodded eagerly, stepping further into the luxurious tomb. "Test it. I want to know it works perfectly." Aldous grabbed the heavy exterior handle of the 6-ton door. With a smooth, practiced motion, he pulled it shut. The massive hinges glided silently until the steel met the concrete frame with a deafening, final clang that vibrated through the floorboards. Aldous didn't hesitate. He didn't look at his wife. He sprinted up the concrete stairs to the surface, emerging into blinding Nevada sun. He walked purposefully to the heavy concrete birdbath. Reaching into his toolbox, he pulled out a custom-machined, 3-foot-long steel wrench. He slid the heavy tool down the hidden access pipe until he felt it lock perfectly into the teeth of the concealed hydraulic manifold. Aldous gripped the wrench with both hands and turned it sharply to the right. Deep underground, a heavy, mechanical clack echoed through the concrete. It was the sound of the internal wheel disconnecting entirely from the locking tumblers. The hydraulic lines were severed. The massive door was now an immovable, permanent wall of solid iron. Aldous pulled the wrench out, casually tossed it into his toolbox, and looked at Carmela, who was standing near the edge of the stairwell, calmly lighting a long, thin cigarette. 60 feet below them, in a beautifully furnished, hermetically sealed box, Wallace Abernathy placed his hands on a heavy internal wheel and pushed. It spun loosely, offering no resistance, entirely useless. He frowned. He pushed again, harder. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his relief. He began to pound his fist against the 6 tons of cold, unyielding steel, screaming until his throat bled. Up on the surface, Aldos and Carmela stood in the blistering heat of the desert. They listened intently. Through 30 feet of bedrock and high-density concrete, they couldn't hear a single scream. The isolation was absolute. The silence was perfect. "Well," Carmela said smoothly, exhaling a plume of blue smoke into dry air, her eyes calculating the immense wealth now left completely unguarded in the empty ranch house behind them. "I suppose we should go pack up his office. The paperwork won't file itself." The erasure of Wallace Abernathy was not a frantic, blood-soaked endeavor. It was a masterclass in industrial precision. While Abernathy bruised his knuckles against the unyielding 6-ton vault door deep below the earth, Aldos Sterling went to work on the surface with the rhythmic, emotionless efficiency of a machine. He backed a heavy commercial cement mixer up to the edge of the spiraling concrete stairwell. The loud, mechanical churning of the drum completely drowned out any microscopic acoustic vibrations that might have somehow breached the bunker's soundproofing. Aldos did not see a murder scene. He saw an open structural void that required filling. He guided the heavy canvas chute over the lip of the stairs and pulled the release lever. Thick, gray sludge cascaded downward, burying the reinforced steps, swallowing the walls, and sealing the gap between the surface and the subterranean entrance. He filled the stairwell to the brim with 20 tons of rapid-setting industrial concrete. Once the cement was leveled and aggressively smoothed with a steel trowel, Aldos laid a heavy, half-inch thick plate of galvanized steel over the freshly poured surface. Over the steel, he dumped 3 feet of dense, rocky Nevada topsoil, packing it down with a heavy mechanical tamper. Finally, he unrolled pristine squares of drought-resistant Bermuda grass, meticulously blending the seams with the surrounding desert scrub, and planted a few mature sage bushes for authentic, visual disruption. By dusk, the brutal heat of the desert had baked the moisture out of the air, and the landscape was entirely transformed. There was no crater. There was no stairwell. There was only a beautifully manicured, desperately isolated lawn, adorned with a heavy concrete bird bath. Beneath the roots of the grass lay an impenetrable, solid pillar of concrete sitting atop a steel vault door. Wallace Abernathy had been fundamentally deleted from the topography of San Miguel. While Aldos handled the physical burial, Carmela was busy orchestrating the bureaucratic one. She sat at Abernathy's massive oak desk inside the empty ranch house, a glass of his expensive scotch resting beside a portable Smith Corona typewriter. The Cuban Missile Crisis was dominating the radio waves in the corner of the room, filling the air with anxious reports of naval blockades and nuclear readiness. It was the perfect, chaotic smokescreen. Carmela rolled a crisp sheet of Abernathy's official Silver Queen Mining letterhead into the carriage. For weeks, she had been meticulously studying his jagged, aggressive handwriting, practicing the signature until her muscle memory could replicate it flawlessly. She drafted a comprehensive, legally binding general power of attorney, transferring absolute control of Abernathy's corporate shares, real estate holdings, and liquid banking assets to herself, acting as a trusted proxy. She crafted a compelling narrative for the paperwork. Mr. Abernathy, driven to absolute terror by the imminent threat of Soviet missiles, had chartered a private flight to Mexico City, intending to disappear into the remote mountains of South America. He was liquidating his life and fleeing the fallout. To cement the forgery, Carmela pulled a heavy brass notary stamp from her designer purse, a tool she had quietly stolen from a county clerk's office in Reno a month prior, and pressed the official raised seal into the document. The next morning, Carmela walked into Nevada State Bank in San Miguel. She wore a tailored black dress and oversized sunglasses, projecting the perfect aura of stressed, burdened authority. When she presented the documents to the bank manager, a nervous, sweating man named Henderson, he barely scrutinized them. Everyone in town knew Abernathy was a deeply paranoid, erratic man who had been prophesying the end of the world for years. Fleeing the country at the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis was exactly what Wallace Abernathy would do. Within 48 hours, Carmela had drained 80% of Abernathy's liquid wealth, wiring the funds through a complex web of shell companies she had established in Switzerland. The remaining 20% she left in the accounts to maintain the illusion of ongoing business operations, ensuring no alarm bells would ring at the IRS. 60 feet beneath the Nevada desert, the horror of a Sterling design was fully realized. Wallace Abernathy was not suffocating. He was not starving. If Aldos had simply locked him in a dark box to asphyxiate, it would have been a mercy. Instead, the bunker functioned with terrifying, flawless perfection. The diesel generator hummed a steady, hypnotic rhythm, drawing fuel from a massive 10,000-gallon subterranean tank. The brilliant fluorescent lights bathed the mahogany walls in an artificial, clinical daylight. The state-of-the-art carbon scrubbers meticulously recycled the air, keeping it crisp and perfectly breathable. Abernathy sat in a luxurious leather armchair in the center of his impregnable fortress. On the coffee table in front of him sat his briefcases, overflowing with bearer bonds and silver certificates. Millions of dollars. It was all entirely, fundamentally worthless. He had walked the perimeter of the bunker 1,000 times. He had systematically inspected every seam, every air vent, and every inch of the 6-ton steel door. There were no weak points. The lock was dead. The heavy wheel spun with mocking freedom. He had turned on the premium ham radio, desperately spinning the dial to call for help, only to discover that the transmitter module had been surgically removed. He could hear the crackling, terrified voices of the world above, but he could not speak to them. He was completely insulated from the apocalypse. He had food, water, and medical supplies to last exactly 5 years. He had no way to turn off the lights, no way to stop the air scrubbers, and no way to open the door. The Sterlings had not buried him in a tomb. They had trapped him inside a perfectly engineered, self-sustaining terrarium of madness. Abernathy stared at the heavy vault door, the terrifying realization settling into his bones. The bombs were never going to fall. The world was going to go on, and he was going to live a very long, perfectly healthy, agonizingly silent life at the bottom of the earth. By the winter of 1963, the acute, burning terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis had metastasized into a chronic, suffocating national dread. The shocking assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas only poured gasoline on the psychological fire. The American public no longer just feared Soviet warheads. They feared the shadows, the government, and the fragile unpredictability of tomorrow. San Miguel, Nevada, became a town of twitchy curtains and hushed, paranoid conversations at the local diner. And in this fertile, toxic soil of anxiety, Sterling Survival Solutions bloomed into an empire of concrete and silent agony. Aldos and Carmela Sterling had seamlessly upgraded their existence, using Wallace Abernathy's stolen silver fortune. Carmela now navigated the dusty desert roads in a pristine, silver Jaguar E-Type, her wrists adorned with heavy Cartier bracelets. Aldos traded his dusty work boots for tailored Italian suits, operating out a sleek, mid-century modern office in the center of town. But the wealth did not satiate them. It only validated their terrifying philosophy. They had discovered the perfect crime, a murder where the victims paid for their own execution, dug their own graves, and provided the perfect excuse for their disappearance. Over the course of 14 months, the Sterlings refined their subterranean slaughterhouse, successfully trapping and burying 3 more of San Miguel's wealthiest households. Their second targets were the Montgomerys. Arthur, a ruthlessly wealthy cattle baron, and his wife, Eleanor. Paralyzed by the thought of radioactive fallout poisoning their massive herds and contaminating their estate, they paid Aldos a staggering $120,000 for a double-occupancy fortress. In May of 1963, Carmela convinced them to undergo a 48-hour lockdown simulation. They descended into the earth with their prized show dogs. Aldos turned the heavy steel wrench on the surface, severed the hydraulics, and buried the stairwell. 2 days later, a pristine, regulation-sized clay tennis court was poured directly over their 6-ton steel tomb. In August, it was Dr. Julian Vance, a prestigious, retired surgeon hoarding a massive, untraceable collection of bearer bonds in his wall safe. He was buried alive beneath the poured concrete foundation of a state-of-the-art equestrian stable. He had commissioned Aldos to build over the bunker's entrance. By November, the Sterlings claimed the Harrisons. Richard Harrison, an aging, paranoid former Hollywood studio executive, and his much younger, socialite wife Vivian were looking for the ultimate off-grid sanctuary. They were locked in a luxurious mahogany-lined vault, and Aldos sealed the access shaft by installing a magnificent, heavy stone reflection pool over the freshly poured concrete. Aldos had drastically streamlined his terrible mechanics. He no longer needed an entire day to erase the evidence. He had purchased a heavy-duty, commercial concrete pump truck and established a legitimate shell company, Nevada Foundation Services, to explain his bulk purchases of industrial cement. The moment the external lock was engaged, Aldos would back the roaring truck up to the entrance. It now took him less than 3 hours to fill a stairwell with 40 tons of fast-curing industrial slurry, leaving absolutely no trace of the heavy engineering that lay beneath. Carmela's bureaucratic camouflage was equally flawless and far more insidious. She didn't just forge signatures to steal their assets. She created elaborate, fabricated lives for the victims. She understood that a sudden, unexplained absence would trigger police investigations. So, she manufactured their escapes. Using a complex network of mail forwarding services and dummy corporations she had set up in South America, Carmela sent letters and telegrams back to San Miguel. A postcard, allegedly written by Eleanor Montgomery, arrived at the local post office from Buenos Aires. The political climate in the States has become unbearable. Arthur and I have purchased a beautiful estancia in Argentina. We are finally safe. Please do not forward mail. A telegram from Dr. Vance was routed through Santiago, Chile, instructing his lawyers to liquidate his remaining minor assets and transfer them to a Swiss account, an account Carmela wholly controlled. The town gossips of San Miguel swallowed the narrative whole. In the local barbershops and grocery aisles, The prevailing theory was spoken in envious, hushed tones. The ultra-rich possessed secret intelligence. They knew the bombs were coming, and they were quietly abandoning the United States to ride out the apocalypse in the neutral territories of South America. The massive, half-finished construction sites of their abandoned estates were merely viewed as the discarded, panicked projects of cowards who had decided to flee rather than dig in. No one suspected that the elite hadn't fled the country. No one suspected that 30 feet beneath the tennis courts, the horse stables and the reflection pools for separate, fully functioning bunkers were operating flawlessly. Down in the dark, the diesel generators hummed, the air scrubbers cycled, and the victims lived in a state of absolute, agonizing, luxurious isolation, screaming at immovable steel doors until their minds finally fractured. The Sterlings felt invincible. They were playing God in the Nevada desert, completely untouchable. But hubris is a blinding disease. In their arrogant rush to accumulate millions, they had underestimated the gravitational pull of the people they had buried. You can easily forge a telegram and pour a concrete slab, but you cannot permanently erase the human connections left behind. The perfect shelter was about to crack. The illusion of the perfect escape requires the perfect audience. For over a year, the paranoid, gossip-hungry residents of San Miguel were exactly that. They willingly consumed the narrative of the fleeing elite because it validated their own fears. But in late January of 1964, the audience changed. A man walked into the San Miguel Sheriff's Department who possessed zero interest in the Cold War, Soviet missiles, or the town's collective hysteria. His name was Thomas Gable. He was an antitrust lawyer from Boston, tailored in heavy wool, and he was the older brother of Vivian Harrison. Detective Eli Vandergrift watched Gable pace furiously across the scuffling linoleum of his cramped office. Vandergrift was a weary, pragmatic man of 52, carrying a shrapnel scar from the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea and a deep, ingrained skepticism of human nature. He didn't care for the wealthy, but he cared even less for mysteries that didn't add up. "I received a telegram from Buenos Aires 3 weeks ago," Gable said, slamming a crumpled piece of yellow paper onto Vandergrift's desk. "It says Vivian and Richard have permanently relocated. It claims they sold the estate and are living on an estancia to escape the geopolitical climate." Vandergrift picked up the telegram, taking a slow drag from his unfiltered Lucky Strike. "That's the going theory around here, Mr. Gable. Your sister and her husband aren't the first millionaires to pack up and head south. The Abernathy, Montgomery, and Vance estates are all sitting empty, too. I don't give a damn about the others," Gable snapped, leaning over the desk. "Look at me, detective. Vivian is 32 years old. She considers a trip to Los Angeles to be roughing it. She despises the heat. She is deathly allergic to mosquito bites. And most importantly, she is clinically, paralyzingly terrified of aviation. She has to be heavily sedated just to look at an airplane. The idea that she chartered a sudden, private, multi-leg flight to the jungles of South America is absolute, unadulterated fiction." Vandergrift exhaled a long plume of gray smoke, his pale eyes locking onto the frantic brother. The veteran cop in him felt the subtle, cold shift in the room. The town's narrative had always felt a little too neat, a little too convenient. "You think the telegram is a forgery." "I know it is," Gable stated coldly. "Someone wrote this to keep me from looking for her, and I want to know who is living in her house." That afternoon, Detective Vandergrift drove his unmarked Plymouth Cruiser out to the Harrison estate. The sprawling property sat in eerie, undisturbed silence. The desert dust had begun to settle on the windows, and immaculate landscaping was slowly turning brown from neglect. Armed with Gable's trespassing waiver, Vandergrift walked the grounds. Everything was perfectly in place. There were no signs of a struggle, no packed bags left behind in a rush. It looked exactly like a home whose owners had simply evaporated. But as Vandergrift walked toward the rear of the property, something caught his eye. Set against the desolate natural backdrop of the Nevada desert was a massive, newly constructed stone reflection pool. It was an extravagant, heavy piece of architecture, completely devoid of water. Vandergrift knelt beside it, tapping his knuckles against the thick, poured concrete basin. It felt unnaturally dense, deeply rooted into the earth. It was beautiful. But to a detective's eye, It felt less like a landscaping choice and more like a geographic anchor. A nagging itch started at the base of Van de Griff's skull. He left the Harrison estate and drove directly to the abandoned property of Dr. Julian Vance. He walked past the quiet, opulent house and headed straight for the rear acreage. There, sitting in the baking sun, was a colossal, state-of-the-art equestrian stable built on a massive foundation of reinforced concrete. Van de Griff stared at it. Dr. Vance was a 70-year-old retired surgeon with severe arthritis. He didn't own horses. He hadn't ridden a horse in 3 decades. Why would he pour thousands of dollars of industrial cement for a stable he couldn't use? Right before fleeing the country, the itch became a burning conviction. Van de Griff sped back to the precinct and locked himself in the archives room. For 6 hours, he ignored the ringing phones and the chatter of the deputies. He pulled the property records, municipal zoning applications, and county building permits for the Abernathy, Montgomery, Vance, and Harrison estates. He spread the heavy, yellowed files across a large oak table, cross-referencing the dates of their supposed escapes to South America with their financial records. Under the harsh glare of the fluorescent ceiling lights, the terrifying geometry of the crime finally revealed itself. The timeline was identical. In every single case, a massive, heavy-duty excavation and concrete pouring project had been authorized exactly 3 to 4 weeks before the victims disappeared. Abernathy had authorized a deep storage cellar. The Montgomerys had signed off on a reinforced clay tennis court. Vance had his stables, and the Harrisons had their reflection pool. But it was the final detail that made the blood freeze in Van de Griff's veins. He pulled a magnifying glass from his desk drawer and hovered it over the signature line of the contractor on all 4 building permits. The ink was faded on the older ones, but the corporate stamp was unmistakably identical. Contractor record, Sterling Survival Solutions. Subcontractor, Foundation Nevada Foundation Services. Authorizing engineer, Aldos Sterling. Van de Griff slowly lowered the magnifying glass. The wealthy elite of San Miguel hadn't hired Aldos Sterling to build tennis courts or pools. They had hired him to build his specialty, impenetrable, subterranean fallout shelters. The detective leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as a horrifying logic clicked into place. If you wanted to make a millionaire disappear and steal his fortune, you couldn't just shoot him in his living room. There would be a body, blood, a crime scene. But if you convince him to walk into a fortified, soundproof concrete box buried 30 feet underground, and then simply poured a driveway over the door, there was no escape to South America. The elite of San Miguel were still exactly where they had always been. They were right under the town's feet. The alarm bell was deafening. Detective Eli Van de Griff knew better than to charge the gates of an enemy compound without a map. He had a theory, horrifying and mathematically sound, but in the sterile, clinical world of the Nevada judicial system, a theory without paper was just the frantic raving of an old man holding a badge. The Sterlings were heavily insulated by wealth and profound lack of physical bodies. To crack their concrete fortress, Van de Griff had to find the structural flaw in their accounting. At 8 a.m. the following morning, Van de Griff parked his Plymouth 2 blocks away from a Nevada State Bank. He walked the remaining distance, his overcoat collar turned up against the biting wind. He wasn't there to ask questions. He was there with grand jury subpoena, authorized by a judge who owed Van de Griff his career. I need the financial ledgers for Wallace Abernathy, Arthur Montgomery, Dr. Julian Vance, and Richard Harrison, Van de Griff stated, dropping the heavy, notarized document onto the desk of bank manager Henderson. I also need the corporate transaction records for Sterling Survival Solutions and Nevada Foundation Services dating back to January 1962. Henderson paled, his eyes darting frantically around his opulent office. Detective, these are our most prestigious clients. The privacy laws are suspended by order of the district court. Van de Griff interrupted, tapping a thick, callous finger against the subpoena. Unless you want to explain to a federal prosecutor why you've been managing the accounts of 4 missing millionaires without raising a single red flag, you will open the vault. It took 2 days for Van de Griff and a forensic accountant from Reno to dissect the financial hemorrhage. The cruelty of Carmela Sterling's operation was not just in the killing. It was in the absolute, parasitic drainage of her victims' lives. The accountant laid out the timeline on a massive chalkboard. "It's a masterpiece of embezzlement, detective," the man said, wiping chalk dust from his suit. "In each case, 3 days after the supposed departure to South America, a newly drafted general power of attorney was enacted. These documents gave a proxy complete control over the victim's assets." "Who was the proxy?" Van de Grift asked, staring at the tangled web of offshore transfers. "On paper, a series of obscure legal firms in Geneva and Panama," the accountant replied. "But when you trace the routing numbers backward to the shell companies, they all funnel into a master holding account under the name CS Holdings. Carmela Sterling. She's been systematically liquidating their estates. She sold Montgomery's cattle herds, liquidated Vance's bearer bonds, and mortgaged Abernathy's silver mine. She's stolen upwards of $6 million in under 2 years." Van de Grift rubbed his jaw, the stubble grating against his palm. The financial motive was ironclad, but theft wasn't murder. Carmela could simply claim she was executing their financial wishes from abroad. He needed a physical link between the construction of the bunkers and the permanent burial of the victims. He needed to prove the concrete above ground didn't match the blueprints below. He left the bank and drove to the county zoning office. He demanded the structural blueprints submitted by Aldos Sterling for the 4 properties. He laid them out next to the invoices from the local cement supplier, High Desert Concrete Company, which had fulfilled the massive orders for Nevada Foundation services. Van de Grift wasn't an engineer, but he knew basic geometry. He calculated the volume. According to Aldos's official county blueprints, the construction of Wallace Abernathy's deep storage cellar required roughly 15 tons of industrial cement. But the invoices from High Desert Concrete showed that Nevada Foundation Services had purchased and pumped a staggering 35 tons of cement onto the Abernathy Ranch during the final week of construction. The discrepancy was identical across all 4 properties. For the Montgomery tennis court, the Van stables, and the Harrison reflection pool, Aldos had purchased more than double the volume of concrete required by the approved plans. "Where did the extra 20 tons go, Aldos?" Van de Grift muttered to himself, tracing the invoice numbers with a red pen. He looked back at the blueprints. The design of the bunkers featured a long, spiraling, 30-foot stairwell leading from the surface down to the main vault door. If you took 20 tons of heavy industrial cement and poured it directly down that narrow stairwell, it would fill the entire void perfectly, creating an impenetrable, solid pillar of rock from the heavy steel door all the way up to the grass. The math was devastating. Aldos Sterling hadn't just built fallout shelters. He had systematically weaponized his own architecture. Van de Grift packed the ledgers, the blueprints, and the concrete invoices into his worn leather briefcase. He had the motive, he had the timeline, and he had the mathematical proof of the burials. He had built a paper cage around the Sterlings. Now, he just needed to look the monsters in the eye and see if they flinched. It was time to pay a visit to the headquarters of Sterling Survival Solutions. The bell above the heavy glass door of Sterling Survival Solutions chimed with a delicate, expensive resonance. Detective Eli Van de Grift stepped out of the blinding Nevada glare and into a sanctuary of mid-century modern opulence. The air inside was fiercely air-conditioned, smelling of imported leather, lemonwood polish, and the faint metallic tang of raw wealth. It was a stark, intentional contrast to the dust-choked, sun-beaten streets of San Miguel. Van de Grift had left his badge and his snub-nosed revolver locked in the glove compartment of his Plymouth. He adjusted the lapels of his borrowed, high-end worsted wool suit. Today, he was not a weary local cop. He was Eugene Miller, a retired railroad executive from Omaha who had recently come into a substantial, terrifying inheritance and was looking for absolute security. Carmela Sterling glided out from a back office, carrying the aura of a woman who had never known a day of dirt or labor. She wore a tailored, emerald green silk dress, her dark hair swept up in a flawless twist. Her smile was immediate, warm, and entirely calculated. "Mr. Miller, I'm Carmela Sterling. We spoke on the telephone," she purred, extending a slender, manicured hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Welcome. Please, come into the lounge. May I offer you a drink? Scotch? Gin?" "A gin over ice will be fine. Thank you," Van de Grift said, letting his voice adopt a slightly reedy, anxious timbre. He followed her into a luxurious seating area furnished with Barcelona chairs and a heavy glass coffee table displaying glossy architectural brochures. As Carmela poured the drinks at a mahogany wet bar, Aldos Sterling emerged from the drafting room. He was dressed in a sharp gray suit, his pale eyes instantly scanning Van de Grift. Aldos didn't look at a person's face. He looked at their center of gravity, evaluating them like a structural load. "My husband, Aldos, our chief engineer," Carmela introduced them, handing Van de Grift a crystal glass. "Mr. Miller is looking to secure property on the edge of the salt flats. He's concerned about the current geopolitical climate." "It's a powder keg," Van de Grift said, taking a sip and perfectly playing the part of a paranoid retiree. "The Russians, the Cubans, I don't trust any of it. I want a place where I can lock the door and let the world burn itself out. But I have questions about the integrity of your shelters. I read that these structures require an astronomical amount of reinforcement. 30, maybe 40 tons of industrial cement just for the foundation." Aldo sat down opposite him, his posture rigidly straight. He didn't blink. "Engineering requires absolute precision, Mr. Miller. We use exactly what is necessary to guarantee structural invulnerability, not a pound less. When the earth shakes, our concrete holds." "And the entrance?" Van de Grift pressed, leaning forward, holding Aldos's icy gaze. "I'm a man who values his privacy. If I go down there, what's stopping the panicked masses from digging me out? What if they tamper with the doors?" "The primary entrance is a 6-ton blast-resistant steel vault door operated by an internal hydraulic manifold," Aldos replied, his voice a flat, emotionless drone. "Once you spin the wheel from the inside and engage the primary tumblers, it is mathematically impossible for anyone to breach it from the surface without military-grade explosives." "It sounds almost permanent," Van de Grift mused, swirling the ice in his glass. He shifted his gaze to Carmela. "Actually, I heard about your firm from an old acquaintance in Hollywood, Richard Harrison. I understood he and his lovely wife, Vivian, commissioned a shelter from you right before they departed." Carmela didn't flinch. Her smile merely softened into an expression of practiced, melancholic nostalgia. "Yes, Richard and Vivian. A wonderful couple. We built them a magnificent sanctuary. But ultimately, the anxiety of living in the States became too much for them. They decided a bunker wasn't enough distance. They relocated to South America. We still receive correspondence from them occasionally." "Fascinating," Van de Grift said. "They must have been very grateful for your discretion." "We provide peace of mind, Mr. Miller," Carmela said smoothly, leaning forward to place a coaster on the glass table. "Whether that peace is found 30 feet underground or on a different continent." As she leaned into the light, something caught the detective's eye. Van de Grift's breath caught in his throat. But years of police work kept his face frozen in a polite expression of interest. Resting against Carmela's collarbone, catching the glow of the desk lamp, was a unique, stunning piece of jewelry. Before Thomas Gable had left the police station, he had handed Van de Grift a detailed list of his sister Vivian's most prized possessions. At the top of the list was a custom-commissioned anniversary gift from a jeweler in Paris, a heavy platinum pendant shaped like a hummingbird in mid-flight, featuring a flawless, unblinking ruby for an eye. Gable had emphasized that Vivian was terrified of losing it. She wore it every single day, explicitly claiming she would take it to her grave. And here it was, draped around the neck of the architect of that grave. It was a fatal error born of pure, intoxicating arrogance. Carmela believed so completely in her own manufactured reality, in the absolute silence of her victims, that she felt comfortable wearing a murdered woman's jewelry as a trophy in broad daylight. She thought she was untouchable. "That is a breathtaking necklace, Mrs. Sterling," Van de Grift said, his voice dropping slightly in pitch. He stared directly at the ruby eye. "My late wife had a fondness for hummingbirds. The craftsmanship is exquisite." Carmela instinctively reached up, her fingers brushing the cool platinum wings. A flicker of something, pride, vanity, perhaps a momentary thrill of the danger, danced behind her eyes. "Thank you, Eugene," she smiled, completely unaware that she had just fastened the noose around her own neck. It was a gift from a very satisfied client before they departed, a token of their immense gratitude. They must have found true peace, Vandegrift replied, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. He had exactly what he needed. The financial records provided the motive, the concrete invoices provided the weapon, and the platinum bird was a physical, undeniable link to a dead woman who was supposed to be in Argentina. I'll need to review my finances, but I am thoroughly convinced of your capabilities, Vandegrift said, shaking Aldos' stiff hand and then Carmela's. Your work is remarkably permanent. Vandegrift walked out of the frigid office and into the scorching Nevada sun. He didn't look back. He got into his Plymouth, picked up the police radio microphone, and keyed the dispatch button. Dispatch! This is Vandegrift. Wake up Judge Hollister. Tell him to meet me at the courthouse in 10 minutes. I need an emergency excavation warrant signed, and I need every available deputy we have. It's time to dig. The heavy oak grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked with agonizing slowness, each swing of the brass pendulum feeling like a hammer strike against the silence. Judge Arthur Hollister stared at the staggering pile of documents spread across his mahogany desk, a cold sweat prickling along his spine, despite the struggling air conditioning in his chambers. Detective Eli Vandegrift stood opposite him, silent and unyielding, the physical embodiment of grim, inescapable truth. You are asking me to authorize the destruction of 4 multi-million-dollar private estates based on an accounting discrepancy, Eli. Hollister began, his voice trembling slightly, betraying the immense political pressure of his position. If you are wrong, if these people are actually sipping cocktails in Buenos Aires right now, the lawsuits will bankrupt this county, and both of our careers will be over. Arthur, look at the math, Vandegrift said, his voice a low, heavy rumble. He leaned over the desk, tapping a thick finger against concrete invoices. Aldos Sterling didn't just pour foundations. He purchased 20 extra tons of fast-curing industrial slurry for every single property, pumped it under the cover of darkness, and buried the access points. The financial ledgers prove his wife has been systematically draining their offshore accounts. And an hour ago, I sat across from Carmela Sterling and stared directly at Vivian Harrison's custom platinum hummingbird pendant, the one her brother swore she'd never take off. Hollister looked from the concrete invoices to the meticulously forged powers of attorney. The sheer scale of the atrocity, the cold, industrial methodology of it, was paralyzing, but the evidence, woven together, formed an ironclad net. With a heavy sigh that seemed to age him 10 years, the judge picked up his fountain pen. He signed the emergency excavation warrants with a forceful, final stroke. God help us all if you're right, Eli, Hollister whispered, handing the papers over. And God help those poor souls if you're too late. Across town, the perfectly insulated sanctuary of Sterling Survival Solutions was rapidly, violently unraveling. The heavy rotary phone on Carmela's desk rang, slicing through quiet elegance of the office. She picked it up, expecting a wealthy client. Instead, she heard the frantic, high-pitched hyperventilation of bank manager Henderson. Carmela, you need to leave. Now, Henderson stammered, his voice laced with absolute panic. Detective Vandegrift was just here with a federal grand jury subpoena. He bypassed my authority completely. He took everything. The holding accounts, the offshore routing numbers, the transfer histories. He knows it all. Carmela slammed the receiver down, the plastic cracking under force. The blood drained from her flawless, manicured face. The charming, sympathetic facade instantly shattered, revealing the feral, calculating predator beneath. Her mind raced, piecing together the timeline. Eugene Miller, the retired railroad executive from Omaha, who asked far too many specific questions about concrete volumes. Aldos, she screamed, her voice tearing to mid-century modern aesthetic like a gunshot. Aldos emerged from the drafting room, a ruler still in his hand, his expression perfectly blank. What is a variable? The police have the ledgers. Vandegrift was a man from Omaha, Carmela gasped, already rushing to the hidden wall safe behind a framed architectural sketch. The structural integrity is gone. They know. Aldos did not panic. Panic was an inefficient emotion that caused mistakes. He merely calculated the new reality. The facade had failed. It was time to abandon the structure. Pack the cash. Leave the silver certificates. They are too heavy and easily traced. only the bearer bonds and the Swiss routing books. He walked calmly into his private office, opened his own fireproof safe, and pulled out the secret secondary blueprints, the damning schematics that detail the external locking manifolds and the exact cubic volume of the buried stairwells. He threw the thick rolls of paper into a heavy metal wastebasket, doused them generously in lighter fluid from his desk drawer, and struck a match. The paper curled and blackened instantly, the smoke filling the room with the acrid, choking smell of burning secrets. Within 10 minutes, they were in the silver Jaguar E-Type. The magnificent V12 engine roared to life, a mechanical beast designed for pure speed and escape. They didn't head for their luxurious home to pack clothes. They headed straight for Highway 95 South, aiming directly for the Mexican border. They had millions tucked into leather briefcases in the trunk. If they could just reach the desolate stretches of Baja, they could vanish entirely, becoming ghosts just like their clients. Aldos pushed the vehicle to 100 miles an hour, the desert landscape blurring into a continuous streak of sun-baked brown and beige. Carmela constantly checked the rearview mirror, her fingers nervously tracing the platinum hummingbird resting against her collarbone. But Van de Grift had anticipated the flight. He hadn't just secured warrants. He had mobilized an entire county sheriff department. 15 miles south of San Miguel, the shimmering heat distortion on the asphalt was suddenly broken by a solid wall of black and white cruisers. Sirens wailed, the sound bouncing violently off the narrow desert canyons. Aldos gripped the mahogany steering wheel, his knuckles turning white, rapidly calculating an escape route. There was none. The rugged, rocky terrain on either side of the highway was impassable for the low-slung sports car. He slammed on the brakes, the Jaguar skidding to a violent, sideways halt in a massive cloud of burning rubber and choke dust. Deputies swarmed the vehicle instantly, pump-action shotguns raised and leveled at the windshield. Van de Grift walked slowly through the settling dust, his overcoat flapping in the hot desert wind. He approached the driver's side, drawing his snub-nosed revolver. "Step out of the car, Aldos," Van de Grift ordered, his voice carrying the immovable, crushing weight of the law. "Carmela, keep your hands pressed against the dashboard." Aldos turned the engine off. The silence that followed was deafening. They were perfectly mathematically trapped. Simultaneously, 30 miles away, the peaceful, eerie silence of the Harrison estate was violently shattered by the deafening roar of diesel engines. A massive, yellow industrial excavator, requisitioned by the County Public Works Department, rolled over the curb and onto the pristine, manicured lawn. Its heavy steel treads tore ruthlessly through the drought-resistant grass, leaving deep, violent scars in the earth. A crowd of nervous, whispering neighbors had already gathered at the police barricades. The operator maneuvered the massive machine to the edge of the extravagant, empty stone reflection pool. He positioned the heavy, steel-toothed bucket directly over the center of the basin. With a grinding, mechanical shriek that echoed across the valley, the bucket smashed downward, shattering the expensive stone and tearing into the earth. The excavation had begun. The heavy machinery dug deeper, the hydraulic arms straining and groaning as they ripped away the topsoil, desperately searching for the solid, unnatural pillar of industrial cement that Aldos Sterling had used to plug the tomb. The earth was finally being forced to give up its dead. The Nevada earth did not surrender its secrets easily. For 3 agonizing days, the Harrison estate was transformed into a chaotic, dust-choked industrial mining camp. The yellow excavator had quickly scraped away the stone reflection pool in the topsoil, only to strike the unyielding 20-ton plug of fast-curing industrial cement that filled the subterranean stairwell. Standard digging equipment was useless against Aldos Sterling's masterpiece. The county had to bring in heavy, diamond-tipped pneumatic drills and teams of men working in grueling, round-the-clock shifts. The air vibrated with the deafening, percussive shatter of jackhammers tearing into the concrete. Detective Eli Van de Grift stood at the edge of the crater for 72 hours straight, surviving on stale black coffee and unfiltered cigarettes, his eyes fixed on the agonizingly slow progress. Finally, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the drill bits broke through the bottom of the concrete plug and struck solid metal with a high-pitched scream. They had reached the 6-ton steel vault door. Because Aldos had severed the hydraulic locking mechanism from the surface, the internal wheel was entirely useless. The rescue crew had to bring down heavy-duty oxyacetylene cutting torches. The stairwell filled with blinding blue-white glare and a shower of molten sparks as the welders painstakingly cut through the heavy steel hinges and the deadlocked tumblers. At 4:15 p.m., the heavy steel door was finally breached. A massive hydraulic winch pulled a slab of iron outward, tearing from its frame with a horrific screech. A rush of cold, stale, meticulously scrubbed air poured out of the dark void. Van de Grift drew his flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the absolute darkness of the antechamber, illuminating the opulent mahogany walls of the Harrison bunker. The low, rhythmic hum of the diesel generator was still beating perfectly. "Police, San Miguel Sheriff's Department," Van de Grift shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete. For a long moment, there was only the hum of the machine. Then a ragged, weeping sound drifted from the main living quarters. Van de Grift stepped through the threshold, sweeping his flashlight across the luxurious leather furniture and the fully stocked library. Huddled in the far corner, pressed tightly against the unyielding concrete wall, were Richard and Vivian Harrison. They had been buried alive for 3 months. Physically, they were healthy. They had consumed only a fraction of their gourmet rations and purified water. Psychologically, they were shattered. Vivian recoiled violently from the beam of the flashlight, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically. Richard simply stared blankly at the open doorway, his eyes wide and vacant, his mind broken by 90 days of absolute, inescapable silence and the terrifying knowledge of his own burial. When the paramedics carefully carried him up the stairs and into the blinding Nevada sunlight, they wept not with joy, but with the raw, animal terror of the resurrected. The horror of the Harrison estate was only the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, the county initiated simultaneous excavations at the Vance, Montgomery, and Abernathy properties. Dr. Vance and the Montgomerys were pulled from their tombs in varying states of catatonia and profound malnutrition, having lost the will to eat despite the overflowing pantries. But it was the exhumation of Wallace Abernathy that scarred the rescue crews for the rest of their lives. Abernathy had been sealed in his bunker since October 1962, nearly 16 months of absolute, crushing isolation. When the welders finally tore open his vault door, they did not find a man. They found a feral ghost. Abernathy had methodically destroyed the luxurious interior of his tomb. The mahogany panels were clawed and splintered, but the most chilling detail was the money. Driven mad by the realization that his vast fortune was entirely useless, Abernathy had opened his briefcases and shredded millions of dollars in silver certificates and bearer bonds. He had built a massive paper nest out of his shredded wealth in the center of the room, curling himself inside it like a hibernating animal. When Van de Grift shined his light on him, Abernathy didn't speak. He simply hissed at the glare, clutching a fistful of torn, worthless $100 bills to his chest. The trial of Aldos and Carmela Sterling in the autumn of 1964 was a national spectacle. The press dubbed them the architects of the apocalypse. Carmela arrived at the courthouse every day attempting to project her usual predatory glamour, but without her stolen wealth, designer clothes, and illusion of control, her charm evaporated under the harsh lights of the courtroom. She just looked small, vain, and exceptionally cruel. The jury remained entirely unmoved by her weeping theatricality. Aldos, conversely, treated the trial with the same emotionless detachment he applied to his blueprints. He sat rigidly straight, observing the weeping victims and the enraged prosecutors as if they were nothing more than unstable variables in a complex equation. He offered no defense, no apology, and no explanation. Morality had never factored into his engineering. It took the jury less than 3 hours to convict them both on multiple counts of attempted murder, kidnapping, forgery, and grand larceny. The judge handed down 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In a profound stroke of poetic justice, Aldos and Carmela Sterling were sent to the Nevada State Prison. They spent the rest of their natural lives locked in tiny, state-funded boxes made of heavily reinforced concrete and steel bars. Aldo spent his days endlessly pacing his 6x8 cell, meticulously calculating its load-bearing tolerances, while Carmela slowly lost her mind listening to the heavy, immovable iron doors slam shut down the cell block. Decades later, the town of San Miguel remained a quiet, sun-baked speck on the Nevada map. The 4 sprawling estates were eventually seized by the banks, their subterranean tombs permanently filled with solid cement and forgotten by time. But the legacy of Sterling's survival solutions lingered in the dry desert wind, a chilling reminder that in an age defined by the threat of nuclear fire, the most devastating weapon of all was never built by a government. It was built by a man with a blueprint, a heavy steel wrench, and the terrifying knowledge that fear is the ultimate trap, time is the ultimate eraser, far more efficient than concrete or fire. By the year 2026, the town of San Miguel had been swallowed by the relentless sprawl of modern Nevada. The dirt roads were now paved highways, the old diners were replaced by neon-lit gas stations, and the horrific legacy of Sterling survival solutions had faded from a terrifying reality into a local urban legend. The Abernathy, Montgomery, Vance, and Harrison estates had been razed decades ago, their subterranean nightmares sealed permanently with municipal concrete and forgotten beneath the foundations of new suburban subdivisions. Aldos and Carmela Sterling had both died in prison in the late 1980s, taking the exact details of their cruel empire to their graves. But structural engineers know a fundamental truth: the earth shifts. In the spring of 2026, a team of geologists surveying a remote, barren stretch of BLM, Bureau of Land Management, land 10 miles outside the old San Miguel limits, noticed an anomaly on their ground-penetrating radar. It wasn't a natural cavern. It was a perfect, geometric void buried 40 feet deep, encased in a massive amount of high-density material. Curiosity overrode protocol. A private excavation crew was contracted, expecting to find a forgotten Cold War military cache. It took them 4 days to dig through the rock and the impossibly thick layer of industrial cement. When their drills finally broke through, they didn't find military surplus. They found a massive 6-ton steel vault door, its hydraulic hinges deliberately severed from the outside. It was a 5th bunker, word reached the Nevada State Archives, and historians quickly cross-referenced the coordinates. The land had never been owned by a wealthy eccentric or an oil baron. The deed from 1961 showed it was purchased under a dummy corporation that traced back to a single name, Aldo Sterling. This was not a tomb for a client. This was Prototype Zero. When the local authorities finally torched the door open, bracing themselves for another gruesome discovery, they found no victims. The air inside was dead and heavy, the generator having rusted into silence decades ago. The opulent mahogany and leather found in the client bunkers were entirely absent. Instead, the walls were bare utilitarian concrete. In the center of the room sat a single, heavy steel drafting table. Spread across the table, perfectly preserved in the dry, stale air, were hundreds of blueprints. But they weren't designed for fallout shelters. They were structural schematics for municipal buildings across Nevada, California, and Arizona, courthouses, banks, water treatment facilities, and state prisons. And on every single blueprint, drawn in Aldo Sterling's meticulous, jagged handwriting, were detailed calculations for structural failure points. He had spent his time not just designing inescapable tombs for the rich, but identifying the exact acoustic resonance, concrete stress loads, and hydraulic weaknesses required to collapse the very institutions that govern society. Beneath the blueprints lay a single sheet of paper, typed on a vintage Smith Corona. It was a manifesto, brief and chilling. Fear builds a foundation. Panic pours the concrete. But when the surface world inevitably collapses under its own weight, those who understand the architecture of the fall will be the ones who inherit the earth. I have left equations. Someone just needs to apply the pressure. The geologists and historians stood in the freezing silence of the prototype bunker, the beam of their flashlights illuminating the terrifying reality. Aldos and Carmela Sterling hadn't just been grifters stealing silver and bearer bonds. They were ideological architects who believed humanity was structurally unsound. The police confiscated the blueprints, sealing them away in classified federal vaults. The prototype bunker was immediately filled to the brim with modern, fast-curing resin, erasing the void forever. But the workers who poured the seal couldn't shake the cold dread that settled in their bones. They looked at the highways, the dams, and the sprawling cities on the horizon, wondering if the cracks were already there, silently waiting for the math to catch up.